Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talks. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room TVs. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio producer. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to any of you out there who are new to the studio, for whom this might be the first time you're engaging with what we do. For those of you out there, here's a little bit more information. The studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, and with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol, and we're a home for early stage ideas, companies, and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, and it's all for free for our residents. Ultimately, we're a safe place for artists, creatives, and companies to take risks at early stages in their development and practice and make time for collaboration. We are delighted that this week's talk is by Verity McIntosh and is called Meet Me on the Other Side. Verity is a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and where she runs the pioneering MA Virtual and Extended Realities course. I got there in the end. Verity is also a former studio producer at the PM Studio and the resident now in her own right. And we're very lucky this talk comes live from the virtual version of the Bristol VR Lab, known as BVRL 2.0. More from Verity shortly. Quick content warning about this talk. There is some mention of griefing, trolling, and issues of sexual harassment. Verity will signal just before she talks about this so you can mute or step away from the stream if needs be. There's a Q&A at the end, as there is every week, with the talk running around roughly 35 to 40 minutes. If you want to ask any questions, please do. Just pop them into the chat window as and when they come up, and I'll pick them out to ask Verity at the end. Or if you like, you can tweet your question to us at PM Studio UK on Twitter. The captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. Before we start, next week's talk is the beginning of a series of talks as part of our Future Themes season. Recently, the studio funded several residents and their collaborators to convene deep conversations about art, technology, and society, conversations that are both hopeful and critically engaged. From now until early December, all our talks will be focusing on what has emerged from those conversations, and we kick off next week with a talk by a new collective called Across the Room, which is comprised of collaborators Invent Eke, Camille Aubrey, Takita Bartlett, and Will Taylor. Motivated by the idea that we should all take a more intentional look at what we're creating and how, the team are interrogating new ways of developing digital facilitation tools that can be applied to virtual spaces, live events, training simulations, and entertainment solutions. And they're exploring inclusively designed, immersive, interactive experiences that appeal to new customer markets that the mainstream does not capture. You can get news on all our future talks and the rest of that season by following us on @PMStudioUK on Twitter or on @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to the newsletter on our website. Don't forget, while you're listening to me talk, hit subscribe on this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link now on any of your socials. We are live and we'd love more people to join us. For now, I'm going to hand over to Verity.
Hi everybody, lovely to see you, nice to be here. My name is Verity McIntosh. As Luke mentions, I am a researcher and senior lecturer in virtual and extended realities at the University of West of England, UE Bristol, and I run the flagship master's programme of the same name. So that's who I am. This is obviously what I look like in real life, of course. You'll meet me in real life a little later, so please enjoy me being a blue avatar for now, and I will walk you through my life as an avatar in the next few moments together. I've been asked to do this talk because I've been doing all sorts of experiments and adventures in social VR, which is an example of which we're in right now. And I wanted to share with you some of my kind of early experiences and findings so that we can start a conversation about what social VR is and what it might be. To explain a bit about where I am, so as Luke mentioned, I'm in the BVRL 2.0 space, which is Bristol VR Lab 2.0. Prior to the COVID circumstance, we were very much based in Bristol VR Lab as a physical space, which was an amazing place in Bristol. thanks to Dan, my amazing cameraman, and also the architect of this world, we now have a sort of virtual simulacra of that space, which you can hopefully see behind me. This is exactly what the building would look like if you were to visit us in Bristol in different times. Due to the incredible affordances of constructing something from scratch in virtual reality, we don't have to stop there. And if you take a little look around with me, you'll find not just the Bristol VR Lab building, but also some of the Bristol icons that locals might recognise. There's a giant crane over there from our harbour side. There's one of what are in fact two Bristol suspension bridges in this world just behind me over there. There is an extraordinary kind of wealth of space and environments to explore here. And I think the intention behind creating it in this way is to create a summoning point, a meeting point for people who are involved in this community in some way and people who are new entrants to that, to come and be together regardless of the times that we're in and our inability to physically be together in many circumstances. So it's lovely to be joining you from here today. It is actually kind of an open world, so you can come and visit it whenever you choose if you have access to this kit, and we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of access later on. We're going to do a small experiment, which I'm going to call the newsreader experiment, in which I'm going to attempt to walk swiftly forwards across a bridge as though I was a newsreader and quote some stats at you. So that's going to work, assuming I can do the running button and Dan can run backwards rapidly holding a camera. So bear with us, this is a live experiment, but we're going to try and do the classic sort of walking over a bridge reciting stats routine. Okay, let's do this. Dan, are you ready? Let's go. Ooh. Ah. Okay. So I'm immediately teleporting somewhere else, which is a deliberate mistake that we're just using to show you. There we go. Okay, so I'm on the move. Dan, are you with me? Yes, great. I'm going to go to running mode. Let's do this. Unlike in the real world, I could physically run through Dan if I went too fast. So let's me attempt to not run through you, the viewer. Okay. So why are we even talking about this today? Other than it's really fun for me to do this experiment with you live on YouTube, this is a really specific moment for VR in general and for social VR in particular. I'm going to halt here and do some stats at you. So one of the things that we're observing is that the kind of global circumstance with coronavirus is leading to a lot of people looking for things that they can do in their own home that connect them in some way. And the early indications are that's having a massive impact on the VR market. Facebook published their Q1 stats earlier in the year, and they announced that something like £297 million in profit could be attributed to their non-advertising sales, which given Facebook's business model means VR. Effectively, that's the sale of hardware. We've also seen in very, very recent times, since the 13th of October, when the Facebook's sort of second very consumer-friendly headset, the Quest 2, was launched, that makers of the big headline title games are seeing tenfold increases in their sales. So we're seeing that people are buying the kit and they're looking for content to experience. One of the phenomenon that perhaps took people by surprise a little bit in the last six or so months is that one of the biggest success stories in VR has been social VR. So to give some sort of context for that, social VR is a platform that's entirely digitally constructed, like the one that we're in now, but that now enables people who are in different places around the world to don their headsets, or in some cases to use their computers and be in the browser, but to participate in something that is very much the same space. So Dan and I are here in this virtual space, Dan's holding the camera and I'm chatting to you, but in theory, hundreds, if not thousands of people could join us in this space as a way of having a basic level of conversation and interaction together. So there are all sorts of different social VR platforms. There are all sorts of different modalities and different ways that people are engaging, whether it be for kind of a casual chat or an event series. I'll walk you through some of the things that people are doing and that I've been experimenting with in the next few moments. But I think in the interests of slightly more direct communication with you, I'm going to suggest that I come out of my headset now and stare you clear in the face. So thank you very much, Dan. Woo. There we are. So with any luck, you're seeing a human version of me in the same shirt, and my little VR person has gone to sleep. So if we can go to the slides rather than just me, I'm going to walk you through some things. So thank you very much for doing that experiment with me. It's been really intriguing to play a bit in social VR, and there's no replica for just kind of showing you what that can look like. Some of the things that I want to just look at together before we get into specifics is what I think or what is considered to be going on with the sort of immersive level of social VR. People talk a lot about presence and this idea of being there as something that's quite distinct to these platforms. And often I get into really good conversations with people saying, well, what's even different about this? Immersion has been around for millennia. I'm immersed in a good book, I'm immersed in a film, I'm immersed in a game. And I completely agree with that school of thought. What I've been trying to work out in my sort of recent research is some of the things around what might be distinctive here. What is actually going on that makes these things like a social VR platform appealing in certain circumstances and perhaps not in others. So there's a couple of core concepts I'm going to academic at you for just a moment, and then I will go back to less academiciness, as is my want. There's an amazing way of thinking about the world, which I find helpful here, which is Cartesian metaphysics. That comes back to a sort of a 17th century philosopher Descartes, who sort of was one of the first to espouse this idea that mind and body are sort of separate, that there's a dualism between mind and matter, and that as humans, these sort of superior beings, we have this sort of separate self that is our intellectual self that can kind of sort of transcend our bodies. Very popular philosophy, particularly in Western cultures around the 20th century. And it's kind of seeded the conversation in the Western culture, certainly, around this idea that it's quite possible to kind of transcend your body. You can leave your fleshy meat bag in your dining room and you can go off and have an existence in a virtual space. We're quite well sort of primed for that as a notion. It's not really surviving as a philosophy in the 21st century, and sort of for the better, I would suggest. But I do think in terms of our comfort levels with imagining that we are somewhere else intellectually and sort of neglecting the physical is a really important thing to be considering in this. There's a fantastic piece by Robert Schweitzer in the 90s, actually 1997, called Overwriting the Self, which suggests that we can do that kind of separation in order to commit fully to these virtual spaces, almost to the cost of our physical selves. But then alongside that, we've got a much more kind of popular philosophy right now, which suggests that what's actually going on is something called embodied cognition, which is almost the reverse. It sort of suggests that we as beings encounter the world, make meaning with the world, and explore the world through our bodies, that we have a very kind of somatic experience with everything that we experience, and we make meaning very much in relation to ourselves as physical beings, and that we shouldn't be trying to sort of separate this notion of self or soul from our physical selves. And there are some that would suggest that this too lends itself really successfully to experiencing things in VR, because if we are sufficiently convinced through the various kind of audio-visual trickery that goes on in VR that we are bodily there, that we are now physically ourselves, but in this other space, that we're very much primed to commit to that we start to apply all the usual rules. I feel weird about walking through Dan as a cameraman, even though I know he's a virtual object. I don't want to walk through him because that feels incredibly rude, and he doesn't want to impinge on my space, and I don't want to drop off the edge of the world, even if the consequences for me sat here with you in this dining room are negligible. We kind of extend our bodies into this space, and we take precautions and we take risks according to our understanding of what our bodies can do in physical space when we go to these virtual worlds. So you've got two almost kind of competing philosophies, but both of whom sort of suggest that there is a difference in the sort of modality of experience that we encounter when we go into these virtual realms, that I think has something to do with why we're sort of finding this little moment that we're in right now. But it wouldn't be a conversation in the era that we're in, which I'm going to start calling the quiz era, without a quiz. And I would like you guys to think a little bit now for me. So there are many, many different styles of social VR, and no two platforms are created equal. So I want you to think about what your answers are to 4 questions. They're A, B, C, and D answers, and whether you answer mostly A's, B's, C's, or D's will tell you something about which social platform are you. So bear with me, I have 4 questions. Are you mostly A's, B's, or C's? How do you like your tech? Are you A, someone who likes it more or less invisible, preferred not to really acknowledge that it's there, it should be the content that's commanding your attention? Do you prefer your technology to be open source and versatile? Perhaps you like it to give you superpowers, to be an augmentation to your normal self. Or do you like it to be top of the range, darling? That's the most important thing. Question 2. I want my avatar to be human and customizable, of my own making, kind of like cosplay, or as much like me as possible. Question 3. My preferred social media platform. We're not talking about social VR, just your social media platform of choice right now. Maybe it's Twitter. Maybe it's Akuna. Maybe it's TikTok. Maybe it's LinkedIn. Which social media platform kind of hits you most? And last question, in virtual reality, I want to meet new people and share ideas. Take part in the creation of a new mode of creative exchange. That one's a little grandiose. Maybe you just want to hang out with your friends. And maybe you want to collaborate with colleagues around the world. It's more of a work tool for you. So I hope you're compiling your answers. Are you more of an A, B, C, or D? Because that will inform the social VR platform for you. And as a small caveat, I completely recognize social VR platforms are absolutely not for everybody, blah, 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 blah. We'll get to that. Okay, if you were mostly A's, perhaps your social VR platform is AltSpace. So we were just in AltSpace. The BVRL 2.0 space was built within that as a sort of an incredible mod and a creation of a world that the team have been working on, but it exists within something called AltSpace. So when you travel to things in AltSpace, they can look and feel a little like that. You generally will have an event or a thing to go to. People will choose to come to that event or sort of moment in time happening, and they will hang out together and do things. One of the things that I did in AltSpace this year was I hosted a couple of open days for the master's program that I run. So we kind of try and reach people through as many different channels as possible, and we have lots of different ways that we engage with potential students, but we do recognise that some of the students that are going to want to join us already have a kind of an active appetite for virtual reality experience, so we constructed a couple of open days, as would normally be on campus in this AltSpace. We were kind of in a little lecture theatre, and we had previous members of the studenthood and current members of the student community to come and host an event with me and take questions from anyone who happened to rock up. And interestingly, we've already recruited a couple of people from that process. It does seem like it's a viable way of going to where the people are rather than expecting them to come to us. Oh, before I get to B, I also did a slightly weird thing. I was going to lots and lots of events in AltSpace. For some reason, it's the one that's really had most resonance for me, and lots of the kind of communities that I travel in outside of VR are choosing AltSpace as a place to go. So I've been to lots of things where I saw lots of people that I already knew and talked about things that we already agreed about. And I was going to try and reach outside of that and try and work out whether AltSpace was my echo chamber or not, or whether I could kind of bust it. So I woke up in the middle of the night to get a different time zone, and just kind of gate crashed a random VR meetup that was in Melbourne, and thought that'll be something different. I'll pop in and see what's going on. Martin, if you can show the brief video to explain what happened.
She's gone. Oh, well. Oh. So where are you from in the UK? Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's coming next week.
Lovely. My mum's originally from Liverpool. Sorry?
I know Reggie Watson is from Avatar.
Oh, lovely. Oh, fantastic. So do you work at a university?
He's a comedian that does events on
Oh, okay.
AltSpace and stuff.
Yeah, I'm from Swindon University, and I work in virtual heritage. Yeah. Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I went all the way across the world to find a 30-something slightly ginger woman with glasses from academia who teaches VR. Not 100% successful experiment. And I guess what I learned is that I think I'm also mostly A's. Like that's when my people are gathering. And like all of these social platforms, they do tend to kind of attract particular kind of social groupings to them that tend to translate from other social contexts. So yeah, AltSpace is probably my jam. So that's mostly A's. If you found yourself as mostly B's, then maybe Mozilla Hubs is the place for you. So you may be familiar with Mozilla from some of their other work. They do amazing work around kind of democratizing the internet. Firefox is their browser. They have kind of lots of free open source digital tools like A-Frame and all sorts online. Their philosophy is always that the internet is for everybody and that it should be an emancipated space for participation. So when they've created this social VR space, Hubs, that's the philosophy that carries through there. What it tends to mean is that you can kind of create your own worlds, you can create your own avatars, you can build things from scratch, you have a good amount of control, which if you're someone who can work in that way can be really, really open and inviting. If you're not the sort of person who knows how to build a world and an avatar and create an event from scratch, or haven't really got the time to engage at that level, it can be quite challenging to engage with. It can work quite nicely if someone else has built that and they send you an invitation and then you just kind of plug in some numbers and you're there. That can be really good because then you're just sort of part of their world. But it does require someone to take on that kind of heavy lifting role. One of the things to note about Mozilla is it doesn't require headsets. Not all of these things do, but most of them presume that one of the primary use cases is that people are in a headset like I was. Mozilla has worked very hard to make sure that the online experience through a browser is every bit as enriched as the VR experience. So it's quite a useful one if you want to do something where some people are going to have headsets, some people don't. Maybe you just want to kind of have a 3D navigable space with no headsets involved. It can be a much more accessible offer than some of the others. If you are mostly Cs, you're the TikTokers of the crew. This is probably for you. Oh, it says Hubs by Mozilla. That's cheeky of me. I actually mean VR Chat. So this is VR Chat, which is one of the biggest platforms. Really, really high usage. There was like 16,000 concurrent users in Steam every day last month. So really, really heavily used. And it tends to kind of skew to a slightly younger demographic. You get a lot of sort of teenagers and early 20s, people who will spend a lot of time in VR Chat. It's a very open world. There's lots of different elements to it. It's very, very broad. All sorts of kind of mini games and happenings that take place in this space. They also kind of go hard and go heavy on avatar choice. So there's vast amounts of very kind of cosplayish style avatars that you can elect to be. The image you're seeing now is me as a stick of butter, of course, and me as a gnome. These are two of hundreds of options that you have. I should note, I'm also waving at myself in the mirror. And one of the things that VR Chat does a lot is sort of put mirrors around so that you can see yourself as one of these sort of enigmatic avatars. Often you're encouraged to change your avatar whilst looking in the mirror just to kind of mix up your identity. Lots of non-human, lots of fantastical characters from pop culture references, lots of anime, lots of manga, that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be quite a sort of playful space. It does skew quite young, as I mentioned. I spent a good amount of time around a fireside eavesdropping on a teenager who was pretty convinced that if he pressed his buttons in the right order, one of his friends who was dressed as a cashew nut would get naked, which I don't think it was ever successful with, but it preoccupied him for a really long time. And that's the kind of conversation you might expect to hear in that space. I can show you a brief video when it gets a bit beyond my understanding. I have since found out what the hell was going on in this, and I'll share it with you afterwards, but I'd be intrigued to know if any of you can figure out what on earth is going on in this next clip.
Beautiful view. Look at it. Look at it. No, but I'm gonna grab a pillow. It's very soft pillow. Well, howdy. It's very soft pillow. You looking for the nearest bonfire?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know where that would be. Yeah.
I'm trying to defeat the cursed whatever that thing is.
True. Oh!
Sorry,
I
there's
can
so
have
many
both
bosses
on.
in that game, it's so hard to I can't even remember all of them.
I think the whole point is that you're not supposed to.
You're not supposed to be successful in that game. And where'd
I
it go?
guess that's how they make money off it, I'd assume.
So yeah, VR Chat can feel a lot like you've crashed someone else's party because all of this just kind of happens in the random world that you find yourself in. For anyone amongst you who didn't get the reference, like me at the time, apparently they were doing something to do with Elder Scrolls, which is a massively multiplayer kind of online community of gameplay that also has sort of tendrils into VR Chat. So they were doing something to do with the Elder Scrolls. Any more info, chuck it in the chat because it's a little outside of my happy place, that one. But it's fascinating and it is kind of really fun people spotting territory if you don't mind the slightly incomprehensible, sometimes quite juvenile context. And it is one of the larger ones, so it's worth a little scurry round. If you said mostly Ds, then you might be someone who prefers something that is very much going to sort of be a tool for you to do your work. there's a huge amount of platforms that have sprung up in the last year or two that are very much designed to be an alternative to going into an office together. And obviously, as we are in this moment in time that we are, the business proposition behind that is really strongly growing. So there's a lot of investment going into these social VR environments that suggest that you can kind of come around the boardroom table and collaborate and do work together. So Meet in VR is one of the biggies for that one, which is the image that you're seeing right now. There's also Engage, there's also Verbella, there's also, which has been around for years actually. Rumi is another one. Spatial is an intriguing prospect because it really kind of dines out on this idea of avatar creation. So you'll notice that in a number of these spaces, the approach to avatars is as real as possible. And in fact, the approach to the spaces is kind of as real as possible. If you imagine that VR is an environment in which you can create absolutely anything that you like, the idea that you create a slightly sort of janky looking mahogany table to sit around seems like a missed opportunity. But the assumption is that there's a comfort level with being somewhere that feels vaguely kind of familiar to do work. So that's me as a spatial avatar. Avatar creation as a small detour is the sort of the secondary industry of social VR. And there are a huge amount of companies that are spinning out that effectively kind of offer to create a digital avatar for you that can exist in one or multiple of these environments. So Lumi is one of the kind of the more trans-platform avatar creation kits. That's me with a Lumi avatar on my face during a Zoom call, which is something that for some reason you might want to do. But the creation of an avatar version of yourself, whether that's as faithful to your physical self as possible or as remote from your physical self as possible, is beginning to be quite a strong kind of trend in this industry right now, and one to watch out for because it comes with all kinds of ethical and philosophical problems that we might touch on a little bit today. It also pummels us quite directly into the uncanny valley. I don't know if it's just me, but seeing myself as that slightly wafty avatar that looks a little bit like I've stopped breathing some time ago is a very strange phenomenon, and it kind of taps into what we know about the uncanny valley, that when the closer things get to being photorealistic, the more we notice what's wrong with them, and the more that we read them as things that are like unsettling or dead even. And we are getting that way with all sorts of things. Sort of slight heads up, this next slide's a bit weird. So there's a very popular mobile app that you can all, if you have a smartphone, iOS or Android, you can all download and play with today, which just talks you through a process of looking at your own head and body and mapping you into this sort of avatar state, and then applying a bunch of preset movements to you. So here I am dancing around, doing what I think is supposed to be a death drop, and then falling from the ceiling for some reason. These are the things that the preset thinks I would want to do. You might notice, depends on how observant you are, you might notice I only seem to be half a person. And that does seem to be because I was wearing black trousers and therefore was invisible. So in this particular experiment, I am top half only, which to be honest, in these moments of Zoom seems entirely appropriate to me. But I can bring this avatar into any number of different virtual environments if I want people to see the slightly kind of bizarre top half of myself that I've scanned. The way this is happening, this is even more creepy. The way that this is happening is effectively the photos that my camera can take can create almost a skin. So this is almost like an unwrapped version of me with really marginal information coming from my camera phone. It can use a bit of machine learning to kind of interpret what different fascias of my face and body are. And it can use that kind of unwrapped skin of me to then wrap it around an existing model. Inevitably, that means that everybody has the same body shape, height, weight, body normativity. Yeah, you can probably imagine where I'm going, but it effectively wraps you to this little model and then creates an animation for you. So detour to avatars aside, one of the things that I've noticed in these kind of business environments is that the virtual conference is king. All the big companies, particularly tech companies, want to have all their conferences in these virtual spaces. And so I've been to a few slightly dry conferences in lots of different environments. And one of the ones that I went to a couple of months ago kind of highlighted one of the core issues for me. So I was at an HTC Vive Immerse UK, very legit, lovely conversation about different ways that people learn, super on the button for my job. but I noticed a mechanic at play. So I was sat in an amphitheatre watching these talks from some interesting people. And there was someone else who was in the amphitheatre whose name was Pablo, who was just sort of walking around trying to get in people's way. He was just kind of making a bit of a nuisance of himself and seeing if he could kind of wave in people's faces or sit on their laps or get in the way. So a couple of times I kind of moved out the way so as not to be bothered by him. And he was choosing all sorts of different people to be irksome to. It wasn't specifically me, but he did kind of pass my way a few times, so I was moving about. The thing that surprised me wasn't that behaviour, actually, because I've experienced that before, and we'll talk a bit about that shortly. It was the response of the platform that surprised me. So twice, I suddenly was teleported back to my original seat and had a little message that came up saying you've been reseated. So I thought, well, I've never had that before, but all right. And then moved again to get a sort of better, safer field of view and walked about a bit. Reseated. And then I think after the third time, I got locked in a different space and a little red text came up and said the moderator has locked you in seat, which meant that I could no longer move. And that felt initially infuriating. I was very cross that I'd been locked in seat. I felt like I was a naughty child. And actually what I'd been doing was sort of in protection of my own body sovereignty and to try and allow me to give attention to this activity. But I'd been locked in seat because I'd been naughty. And inevitably, this sort of Pablo character, whose role it seemed to be was just to be a pain to everybody, figured out that people who were being locked in seats were there. And he just stayed there and stayed in everybody's face. And I had to quit the app and go back in again to see if I could improve on the situation. It was clearly that was the mechanic they were using. So I abandoned that conversation and sent a complaint to the company, who sent me something back saying, some of those issues we're aware of. Our developers are going to look into it. Thank you, bye. And that was it. So hence me sort of venturing onto Twitter and trying to extract something slightly more nuanced from them. Because for me, it speaks to a broader problem that we do sometimes see in social VR, in that these sorts of the commitment that we make in terms of our embodied cognition means that we feel quite physically vulnerable. And if people choose to take advantage of that affordance to get in your face, to make lewd actions, or to try and talk to you, depending on the platform, it can feel very affronting, it can feel very physical, it can feel quite real. And for me, it's the responsibility of these platforms, right aside from the individual behaviours, to manage against that. Many platforms have systems for reporting and blocking and barring that kind of behaviour. This one in particular almost just neglected to have the conversation about whether or not they would. So yeah, I mentioned in my talk write-up, my nemesis is Pablo. Pablo was an asshat, don't get me wrong. Pablo was a total tool, but Pablo was enabled by the platform that did not protect me and that enabled Pablo. Why on earth wasn't Pablo being locked in seat, for goodness sake? Where were the moderators? So these are all questions that we have for social VR spaces. What's the moderation? What's the mechanic for reporting bad behavior? What are the kind of automated processes that should prohibit it? We're very, very early doors with some of this, and some platforms are doing it well and some platforms are doing it really poorly. So I'm going to whistle stop through some of these. What are people actually doing in VR? Are they really using it? And yes, they are, and it's for all sorts of different reasons. Reggie Watts, some of you may know, is a fantastic comedian and musician. He's been in AltSpace since it was born, and he does regular stand-up gigs and events, and people will visit from all over the globe to take part in quite a traditional live performance. We see increasingly kind of large-scale gigs with relatively recognisable names taking place in social VR. So again, people can kind of don their avatar of choice and attend together. We're seeing an interesting kind of dynamic creeping in with various games. So The Under Presents is a really fascinating game by Tenderclaws, which seeks to straddle somewhere between a game and immersive theatre. And like both of those, it encourages lots of people to participate at any one time. And it has little kind of social VR spaces where outside of the core narrative, people can be together, and all kinds of community behaviours have emerged around sort of holding various objects to communicate with each other and identify yourself. So we're seeing sort of things that aren't specifically social VR platforms also developing a social layer to them. With The Under Presents particularly, it's a sort of a fascinating kind of triple dynamic, because you have the pre-recorded non-playable characters, you have the live participants, and you also, at least in the early stages of this game, have a sort of a third community of live performers who are taking part from their own homes and who are effectively actors in that space, so that you may encounter a games character and you may encounter a real person, and often it's quite hard to tell the difference because everybody is an avatar. And it's a really interesting thing to see, where you start to read nuance into people's speech patterns and people's body movements that suggest to you whether somebody is a physical person or not. One of the more recent and sort of massive events in social VR was Burning Man. So as some of you will know, Burning Man normally gathers 80,000 people in the desert in America to come and take part in this sort of huge music community event where massive communities of artists will build things for each other and develop experiences and have live music. And it's a whole destination in and of itself that then disappears at the end of Burning Man. As luck would have it, they were quite committed to this idea of theming it this year as metaverse. And so when COVID hit, they put the call to the community that they already work with and said, would anyone consider doing Burning Man in VR this year? And people built extraordinary amounts of work in AltSpace again, actually. Somebodies created BRC, which is Black Rock City in VR, which was a sort of a direct simulacra of the desert. And then people built installations and temples and happenings and vehicles and games and flying mechanics into this desert space, such that you could still kind of visit and just follow your nose and randomly meet people and get involved in stuff in the way that's very core to the Burning Man experience. It was hugely, hugely used. And in fact, some of those spaces are still available now. So if you want to pop in and have a little shifty, BRC is a pretty good place to start. But I saw the makers afterwards talking about it, and they had no idea that their community, who are often quite analog, they're metallurgists and artists who build things from scrap stuff, took so readily to these digital tools and really enjoyed the challenge of trying to create something that was particular to virtual space. A lot of people used it as a time machine to kind of visit Burning Man in the 90s or in the noughties. So it's an interesting one to see how people kind of took that invitation. There's some stuff coming up. There's always stuff coming up. But if you're starting to think, I want to see what's going on, there's a few things on the horizon. So Rain Dance is a film festival, usually based in London. This year, like everything, online. And their immersive strand will be at least predominantly in social VR too. So you can check out some of this. It means that you get to attend things with other people, which has an interesting social dynamic. Electric Africa is an incredible festival based in South Africa, but across the continent, which draws together people who are making work specifically for VR. And again, they're hosting their event and their festival in social spaces. And then because it's Halloween shortly, virtually every platform has like 1 billion Halloween events. So if you want to don an avatar costume and have a little scoot around some haunted places, every single platform has a myriad of kind of community organized Halloween events that you can check out. So that's some stuff on the horizon. To have a little step back for a minute, that's a bunch of stuff that I've been doing or that other people are doing that exists in the world. And I think it helps to give you a bit of a picture of what's going on. But I do want to step back for a second and just try and figure out some stuff with you about what it's doing or what it's for, I guess. It's all very fun, but it can be quite a toy. So one of the things that I want to think about is the potential of social VR. I think in the immediate moment, the kind of yearning for social contact is high, and feelings of isolation and loneliness are really important social markers for us right now. So I think it's creating opportunities that are absolutely not the same as being together, but that provides some other way to be together that's really appealing to different people right now. I think the opportunity to go anywhere and be anyone has its own sort of seductions. And I think there's all sorts of incredible platforms that specifically allow you to kind of visit, like Google Earth, a particular place that might have some emotional resonance for you, even though you can't be there. And I think the potential longer term for us to reduce our global travel, which we know has a huge impact on the climate crisis, is really strong here. So if we don't physically need to be together, but we want more than a Zoom call, maybe here's an alternative. And I guess in theory, at least, it's an opportunity to be anyone, to have a more fluid sense of your own identity and to kind of decouple yourself from your body in a way that appeals to different communities in different ways. It has a serious flip side, that one, but in theory there's a potential to find more fluidity in the way that you are encountered, in the way that you receive the world, that has opportunity within it. Of course, on the other side, we know that there are all kinds of problems, some of which I've alluded to already. Accessibility is a massive thing, particularly for headsets. You know, this is like one of the newest ones, and it's still quite heavy and quite expensive and quite cumbersome and can be quite uncomfortable after a period of time. It presumes a certain physical makeup that is certainly not common to humans. It kind of comes from an inherited cultural context of the West Coast of America, which has all its biases cooked in. So we know that there are all kinds of reasons, and I can talk about that forever, so maybe another day, all kinds of reasons why it's not a fully accessible technology right now. And it is creating potentially a stronger digital divide between those that have access and those that do not, which kind of compounds the social problems that we have right now. Avatars themselves often presume certain physical normalcies, or the assumption that you would wish to be a particular style, which is often based on a very kind of cis body normative assumption. Mostly you kind of 30-year-old white guy has lots of options. Other people do not have lots of options when it comes to avatar creation. A brief nod to the privacy situation. Again, it's a whole other talk, but this and many of the more popular tools at the moment are owned and produced by Facebook. And the reason Facebook's in the game is because their business model is around data. And VR particularly gives an incredibly rich data source in terms of what we choose to do, where we choose to go, who we choose to meet, how we move our bodies, how we respond to certain stimuli, like the data that can come, not just from where I put my mouse, but from where I put my eyes and my hands and my body. That is absolute gold dust for a company for whom data is the business model. And so the trade-off that we make when we enter into these spaces, and the control that we give away around how our data is managed, is a really important decision that everyone's having to make right now. I'm obviously sort of jumping in with both feet, but not without realizing the Faustian bargain that's struck. The last sort of challenge I wanted to reference, I guess, comes from this picture. So as we were saying earlier, there is a blur between your physical and your virtual experience. And because we're not terribly well versed and we're not very used to this idea of being in a virtual space, the kind of etiquettes of those spaces go away. And I think sometimes the translation of bad behavior in online spaces into virtual spaces is so much more pronounced because we don't sort of view it as real. The example here is Mark Zuckerberg when he was first sort of presenting one of their social VR platforms. They did a demo live on stage where they kind of did a visit to Puerto Rico that at the time was suffering with some serious floods. And because of the sort of cognitive dissonance that seemed to be going on at the time with him and his co-presenter, like, isn't this awesome? High five, what's up guys? And it was presented as this like fun bit of disaster tourism that probably isn't real because we're all avatars now, and isn't it hilarious? And that kind of behavior does carry through. Disaster tourism is a real issue for VR right now. This sort of idea that you can just go and like hang out with people whose lives are worse than yours and therefore feel kind of good about yourself and your life is really prevalent in terms of the content that we're seeing coming forwards. It's also giving rise to these kind of behaviors that we're seeing in kind of griefing and trolling. So, on that, I am going to briefly mention the issue of sexual harassment in VR. So if that's a trigger point for you, I will just wait a moment before continuing. So if you want to step out, it's about 3 or 4 minutes. But yeah, please do feel free to step away at this point if that's something that you don't want to spend time with. Oops. Okay. So it's a huge deal. In January, 50% of female social VR users reported having at least one instance of what they regarded as sexual harassment in VR. There are different ways that manifests and different experiences that are reported. But this idea that particularly if you manifest as a female avatar, that you are at greater risk of harassment than any other participant in that space is relatively consistent across the research. And it's a huge, huge issue right now. So as we've started to mention with my example with Pablo, some companies are trying to address that in the way that they manage these platforms. There was a really interesting article from Michelle Cortesi and Andrea Zeller recently that was trying to sort of suggest designing safer social VR spaces. And they suggest things like regarding the proxemics of the characters. So there should be different rules for your intimate space to protect your body sovereignty, and then sort of an extra layer that's considered to be personal space that perhaps may or may not be intrudable upon, that then there's a social space and there's a public space, and that there should be different rules for those different things. questions of consents, respect, personal space bubbles are everywhere. Most of the social VR platforms now have a personal space bubble that you can switch on. That means people can't come within a certain distance of you, and that if they try, they go invisible. There are many that will only let people speak to you if you've agreed that they are a person that you want to have an audio conversation with, or that you're prepared to have in your personal space. And there's often a system of sort of friends within these spaces, so you can kind of approve some people and disapprove others. What we're not seeing to the extent that I would personally advocate for is accountability for bad behaviour. A lot of these kind of controls are presuming that the person who's likely to receive the bad behaviour is responsible for policing it. So you have lots of controls for your personal space bubble, or if you're lucky, a reporting procedure for bad behaviour. But there's very little transparency about what even happens when you report someone. You can kind of, in the moment, potentially block them from your site. But as far as we can tell, and obviously the companies aren't in a hurry to tell us this, as far as we can tell, there's no adverse effect for the people who are causing these bad behaviours. Often they just come back in again and start again. So there's a real lack of accountability and a real unfair expectation on people who are experiencing poor behaviour to be the ones managing that, which I think needs to change immediately. One lovely vision of the future that a student of mine presented last year in a piece called Virtual Love Islands has something to tell us, I think. So Ellie Rickold and Josh Pawlowski created Virtual Love Islands, in which naked couples are speaking about what they love about one another's bodies. It's sort of a series of interviews for people who are often not body normative and from different communities, talking about how they love each other and what drew them to each other in the first place, and the wibbly wobbly bits of their bodies that they find attractive. And you can spend time with them, and you're sort of entitled and invited to listen and to be with them. But if you go close and if you touch, they will tell you off. They will tell you that actually I'm a real person in real life. Like, I would not like you to be touching me right now, and so don't touch me here. To try and get you to think about what rules you're applying in virtual space that you wouldn't apply in the real world. And if you persist and if you continue to get too close or to touch them, they will kind of burst into a series of pixels and effectively leave the room, so you don't get to spend time with them anymore. And I really like the kind of the provocation there around consent and expectation of behaviour. It can feel quite jarring in the moment, but it's actually very kind of it's held with a wry humour that allows you to participate and learn from that experience. Okay, so that we can get to questions, I'm going to have a little cheeky zip through this last bit so that I make sure that you can talk to me. One of the reasons I think social VR is important right now is it's kind of going somewhere. So simultaneously to the social VR platform revolution thing that we're seeing in quite a small community, we're also seeing a huge surgence in what are being called virtual beings. So particularly on platforms like Instagram, there are a bunch of influencers and people who do not exist, who are gathering massive amounts of attention, particularly in the sort of under 18s market. So Michaela, you'll see in the middle left there, has 2.5 million followers on Instagram, and she's a model and releases music and has a whole digital life. That's becoming a really normal phenomenon in certain circles. In fact, one of my students has a current virtual being called Evie Digigram, who I would encourage you all to follow on Instagram. She lives in Bristol and is a particular advocate for COVID safety and is a vegan, and get to know her, even though she doesn't technically exist, if you're so inclined. We actually are starting to live with digital creatures all the time. We may not think about it that way, but every time you speak to Alexa or to Siri, you're conversing with a sort of human-esque entity that is not real. And there's all kinds of things around the data exchange that comes with that. And so if we project forward a little bit and we think a bit about what the sort of social virtual experience will be, particularly if it goes into the real world, which we know it is, there are a number of different companies who have explicitly said they're developing AR headsets, glasses, contact lenses, be it as it may, that will allow you to overlay a digital version of the kind of virtual world into your real life. That is at least in some way coming for us as a society. And a lot of these behaviours that we're seeing being rehearsed in social VR right now are going to translate directly into this much more kind of real environmental social space. Those that are augmenting the world and those that are not will have a really different experience of the physical world. And the way that we exchange between those things is a behaviour we're practicing now that we're going to live out for decades to come. So I'm going to invite you to start popping your questions in the chat now. I'm going to leave you with a fantastic clip from this piece, which is a few years old now, but incredibly interesting in terms of the future projections, called Hyperreality by Keiichi Matsuda, who is an artist who is also kind of preoccupied with what happens when we start to digitally augment our physical lives. And I want you to have a little think about whether it's something that you think is something you'd like for your life, or something you want to make sure never happens. It's extraordinary how this tends to divide the crowd, so I want to see where you land, and I will join you afterwards for a nice Q&A with Luke. Over to you, Martin.
Fantastic. Great. Nice. Great.
Más tarde. Apúrate si quieres una buena calificación.
Voy lo más rápido que puedo.
¿Has pensado en correr? Es saludable y eficiente.
Seguro que no hay más trabajos disponibles. Yo estudié para ser profesora y estoy haciendo mercados.
Y además puedes quedarte con los puntos de fidelización. Eres una monkey afortunada. Tienes que confiar en la aplicación. ¿Te sientes inspirada? Gracias. Chao.
¿Quién soy yo? No, eso no es lo que quiero decir. ¿Para dónde voy? No. Puedo volver a empezar. Olvídalo.
Estoy presente ahora. Me amo. Estoy libre de mi ira. Estoy libre de mi tristeza. El amor es mi regalo.
Habla español. Adiós. Hola. Me llamo María.
Okay, so I think it's worth thinking now about the future and choosing carefully how we learn about and how we engage with these things. If it's the sort of thing that you do personally like thinking about and figuring out and that you want to take part in the future of, we actually do recruit for the Masters throughout the year. It starts in January 2021. We are nearly done with recruitment for this year, so if you should be talking to me about that, please talk to me soon. My details are on here and I think are going to be on the YouTube link as well. Always happy for a chat, or if you just want to chew this over with me in person, I love a chat. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Luke.
Verity, thank you. It's always a privilege to speak, particularly on stuff when you have this like depth of knowledge. The people are already telling us in the chat that you've told them the future, which is
I hope not.
Anticipated that, obviously. I want to dive straight in because we're short on time for a question which is probably not unexpected. The question is, hi Verity, currently discussing the speed of VR/AR mass adoption. My thinking is that within 5 years it will be ubiquitous, others say longer. What do you predict or intuit?
Well, it depends on where you mean, doesn't it? I think ubiquity tends to be a sort of a term that we apply to like US, UK, and then sort of disregard the fact that ubiquity is supposed to mean everywhere. I think with inevitable sort of social geopolitical context, these technologies still remain quite kind of a Western elite opportunity, and in sort of Japan and South Korea too, there's a high take up, but we're still seeing it being a really challenging platform for anyone to engage with in the wider world. So I do think for true ubiquity, if that's even something that we would want, it's going to take a lot longer. We are interested. I put the Electric South Festival on there, the Electric Africa thing, because actually there are some incredibly prolific and interesting makers in and around South Africa, particularly at the moment, who are driving it in a way that you might not expect. So we're seeing kind of pockets of activity in terms of technological development and content creation around the world. I think it will be a long time before it's sort of the equivalent to the mobile phone. There are all sorts of different things that can change that. I mean, I don't think any of us expected the acceleration that we've seen this year, and it's been entirely driven by COVID, because the sort of use case around home use just ballooned. And if you'd asked me this time last year, I'd say try not to spend too much of your time developing for home use, because it's like a 1% take up in the UK. It's now more like a 10% take up in the UK. And actually the out of home stuff has seen a real problem, because people can't share headsets in arcades and in VR theatres and so on, but they can potentially have one in home when it starts to be at the sort of price point that people expect for gaming consoles or for mobile phones. So the market has shifted enormously in a way that's catalysing that behaviour. It's a bit difficult to guess how the next phases are going to go, because again, we are kind of in the middle of a huge cultural upheaval right now, and we don't know how long it's going to go, and we don't know what the longer implications are. We have a huge recession coming, that's certain. So the impact that will have on this market is going to be really interesting to track. I suspect it means that different recovery rates for different countries will motivate where the activity comes in, and I wouldn't necessarily look to the usual suspects for that kind of accelerator activity. But I do think there's a really strong community in Bristol, particularly, that's sort of that's a very supportive community, and there's a lot of people who are really prepared to share and to learn together and experiment in a way that feels quite, and actually have a critical conversation about this stuff that I find really helpful. So I think there's lots of grassroots. I think lots of projections suggest AR is going to hit quickest, but they mean enterprise level AR. So that's more kind of, if you're in a power plant, you want to have a visor that's going to tell you what the different kind of data readings are from your pipes, more so than the more kind of entertainment and humanities focused stuff that I tend to skew towards personally. So yeah, different things are going to in different ways. But yeah, in like all technologies, like the military's doing a bunch of stuff, porn's doing a bunch of stuff, art's doing a bunch of stuff, and these things all kind of create this ecosystem.
Great. So someone's asked 3 questions.
Is it Zara?
I'm going to try and squeeze them into one.
Okay.
Are there more ethical VR platforms emerging? Like, for example, what means might there be to make a political / empowerment difference, like data, for example?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important that question is asked loudly and often. Regrettably, at the moment, the market is growing mostly for Facebook. Like the majority of what's motivating the progress right now is the incredible amounts of investment that Facebook has put into developing the hardware and the software platforms that support their own ecosystem. And it's quite a challenge to engage fully outside of that ecosystem. It is possible, and there are lots of alternatives. I'm sort of surrounded by some of them currently, because I'm trying to do that too. You have to kind of work harder, and there are trade-offs. But what I think we definitely need is more entrants into the market who are going to challenge that and who are going to suggest alternatives. I love that sort of Mozilla are holding firm on the various principles that they've attached to the hubs proposition. But again, like it's a small nugget in there with a bit of a lot of momentum behind some of these other platforms. There's a real question coming about whether Facebook holds too heavy a monopoly in this industry, because they are freezing out a number of other promising contenders from the beginning. So I think we need more objections, and we need more diversity of voice within this, and we need more assumptions cooked in about what the users want. At the moment, the assumption is that the users want friction-free access to content and social contact. And that they don't care about data exchange, and that they don't care about privacy, and that they don't care about the corporate intentions of the service providers. And as long as the market behaviour supports that assumption, that will continue. So we need more strong advocates for something else.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze 2 more in. There's a question that says, I'm a fan of Tilt Brush, Gravity Sketch, etc. Not just using, but seeing other people who are really good at it, like Rosie Summers, who's some people will be aware of Rosie's amazing work.
She's awesome.
How do you see that developing in a social space, for example?
Great question. It's like weirdly absent from a lot of these social VR spaces. So that what you're talking about, creation tools. So there's a number of really wonderful things like Tilt Brush that allow you to kind of paint and design and sculpt in 3D. And it's one of the most joyful things you can do in VR as you start to kind of create things in these three-dimensional virtual spaces. And for whatever reason, those creator tools are not really finding much of a space in VR. There's a lot of assumptions that in these more businessy ones, you might want to bring in a 3D model and do some sort of graphic design stuff. There's the use case for that isn't really being proven out as much as the makers would imagine, but that more kind of just joyous creation and particularly collaborative creation hasn't really like hit its groove yet. I think that will be coming soon. I think there's probably something around kind of server load when people start to do these creative things collaboratively. But yeah, I mean, this is a really trite example, but in the recent upgrade to Beat Saber, which some of you all know is like a really fun rhythm game, you're now able to play just within sight and view of 3 other people. And that's a sort of a social component. You're not really influencing them, you're trying to beat them, but there's nothing really that you're collaboratively creating together. But just the sort of frisson of knowing that they're there in their living rooms playing the same music track as you are has a certain dimensionality to it that I think is quite fun. So yeah, I'm hopeful that more co-creation will kind of balloon as the capacities improve.
Great, yeah, and for those of you watching in Bristol, if you're familiar with the graffiti artist Andy Council, he is a resident of our own the studio and has been working in Tilt Brush himself as well. Like Rosie Summers, you can check out some of his work on Twitter. I'm going to squeeze one quick question in, Verity, before we go. Okay. And this question I have, which is, given that you're leading a course that's kind of like looking at this, looking at VR and its creative applications, like what kinds of creative challenges are you setting your students?
I mean, all of this. So it's hard to answer in like a minute or less because we do a whole year's worth of cool stuff together. But I guess we try and do. So we talk about this critical landscape simultaneously to making, and for us the intention is to kind of do those things always in tandem. So we're always listening to thought leaders in the piece, and we're trying to have good debates and good arguments and try and unpack some of the problematics of this and the ethics of this. And at the same time, we're always making and prototyping and trying to kind of apply some of that thinking to the practice. So sometimes that's like an afternoon's worth of prototyping. Sometimes that's sort of a longer form piece of practical work that we'll do in partnership with an industry partner or as a sort of self-motivated project. But for me, I'm trying to give people a window into all of these different questions and a kind of a practical literacy of all the different types of tools and technologies that they might encounter in their careers, so they can get super comfy with them. They know what they are, they know what the affordances are, they know what the problems are, and then they can kind of choose as critical makers what they're going to engage with and always have questions behind what they make. So that's kind of what we do.
Great. So there'll be contact details for you, Verity, coming up at the end of this. Verity, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you so much for spending time with us. It was a pleasure. I look forward to having you soon, hopefully. Before we let you go, a quick plug for the next week's talk is the beginning of a series of talks as part of our future theme season. So recently the studio funded several residents and their collaborators to convene deep conversations about art, technology and society, conversations that are both hopeful and critically engaged. From now until early September, our talks will be focusing on what has emerged from those conversations, and we kick off next week with collaborators Inven, Camille and Takita, who'll be talking ethno-augmenting social realities. They've been looking at ways of developing digital facilitation tools for cultural relevance in physical and virtual spaces, beginning with the inclusion of Black, African and Caribbean voices in the creation process. And they've recently added fellow resident Will Taylor as a collaborator as well. More information on that will be on our website next week and on our Twitter and Instagram feeds, which you can find at PM Studio UK on Twitter or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. And you can get up-to-date information on the studio, our talks and other events and activities via our newsletter on our website. Don't forget, before you go, whilst you're listening to me close out today's talk, hit subscribe on this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link after the talk is finished. All our talks are available to watch again after they have finished being live, and you can share them on your socials as and when you are ready. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again, same time, same place next week.